Hello, I'm Giorgio Baldini, and today I'll be showing you how to draw a realistic painting of Yosemite and the waters. Here are the materials that I have chosen to use. These are the paints. As you can see, I've used Ivory Black, Burnt Umber, Sap Green, Cerulean Blue, Ultramarine, and lemon yellow hue. I also used the white gouache for many of my highlights you'll see in my videos. Later in the video. I'll be showing you a realistic approach using watercolors with different techniques. Here's the reference that I have chosen to use. I'm getting my materials ready. Here's a stick eraser. They're very helpful. HB pencil. You'll need them for your sketch outline unless you decide to use tracing paper. Either way is fine. So the first thing I'm starting off is with the sky. So basically what I'm starting off to do is using a wet on wet technique. So basically what that is I'm pre-wetting the paper so that it makes a nice, so that the watercolor will just sit beautifully, nicely on top of that. As you can see, I'm mixing a little bit of cerulean blue hue very lightly. I'm making sure it's mostly just water because it's very subtle and faint. It's not super blue, it's mostly white. I'm also adding some gouache over the sky, but I'm making sure to keep everything very light because as you can see in the reference, the values are pretty light up there. When you use wet on wet techniques, it's like a very more expressive style, whereas a wet on dry technique allows you to get more sharper, crisp details, which you'll see me use later in the tutorial on areas like the mountains and the rocks. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting to add in the mountains. I mixed up some black with a little bit of my ultramarine and a little bit of burnt umber to get this nice color. It's kind of a darkish, cool gray color. I'm just painting in. I find that it's easy to paint in the darkest areas first, just to establish all the shadows, so that doesn't get confusing later on, because as you know, watercolors dry much lighter than they actually look, and so while this may look dark, it'll end up drying much lighter, you'll see, and you'll have to go over it and over until you get the correct value. So I'm just painting in the basic shapes of the rocks, not trying to focus on too much detail right now, because we're just blocking in the base coats of the painting, as you can see. I'm also mixing up some burnt umber and sap green to get that greenish color, as you can see. The green foliage bordering the rocks. I found actually out that in the reference the foliage was much darker than what I had mixed in the painting, so it's important to check how accurate your colors are, because I had to end up correcting it towards the end of the painting. Right now it looks fine, but you'll see later how it was off and how I had to fix it. So I'm just adding little speckles around the rocks. There's little bushes, little cracks, indentations in the rock. It's really important to notice these features. I'm just adding more watercolors. I'm going in with back in with my darker colors. I'm mixing up a little bit of a darker green. I just added some burnt umber or ivory black to that. That'll darken it up real nicely. Also making sure to go kind of around the waterfall area. Added a little bit of blue to that just so it's not plain white, because in reality it has shadows and stuff. It's really important that you keep checking your reference. That's what you'll see me doing a lot when I'm not painting. I'm looking at my reference, because you really want to make sure it's accurate to your picture, so it looks realistic. And by the way, right now I'm starting to paint in some of the little grass in the foreground. I'm in the midground of the painting. And now I'm starting to add in the foliage, just basically using a light version of the sap green, less concentrated, more diluted version. Making sure to keep everything light. I'm going actually in with my lightest trees first, so that if I make a mistake, it's easier to correct it than if I was to go in with my dark areas. I find that if you go super dark with watercolors, it's harder to correct your mistakes than it is if you go a little lighter. So it's always a little bit better to put not enough paint on your paintbrush than put too much, I find. Adding some more darker values of green by just mixing up either burnt umber or ivory black. Those are great colors to darken up your greens. Or you could use it as complement, like a red color. Just a complement of green is red. I'm using my smaller brush just because I started off with my round brush for most of the painting, but I'm using my more my flat brush because it's better for this tree strokes. I'm basically just going in lines up and down for the trees in the direction of which the trees are going in. Now I'm starting to paint in my darker values of the trees. So these are what's behind the trees in the very front. I mixed up some ivory black and burnt umber and some sap green to get this darker kind of brownish green color. Making sure to paint it behind and a little bit into the green trees in the front. You don't want to keep this too dark at the beginning because, like I said, if you make a mistake, it can be harder to correct it. But you're going to want to build up in layers because watercolor dries really fast. I mean, not really fast. It dries really light. Excuse me. So now I'm adding a little bit of a lighter mid-tone values to the right portion of the mountain. As you can see, it's kind of a grayish blue tone. I'm adding some ultramarine because I noticed that my original tone was a little too dull. It needs to be a little bit more saturated. So now I'm blotting it with a tissue, just lighting it up. If you have areas that are too dark and they're still wet, a great way to do that, to get rid of that, is just to blot with some tissue. I find it very helpful. Now I noticed that some of these trees aren't dark enough, so I'm just going in with that same mix that we've been using, the burnt umber and ivory black. And you don't have to have the same exact colors that I do. It's more important that you understand the techniques that I'm using rather than the exact colors. And pretty much it'll be fine if you have any kind of dark brown and green will work for this, as long as it's on the more warm side of the color wheel. Just darkening up my values at the top of the mountain. Now I'm starting to paint in some of that green tree, as you can tell, you know, to the left. So I'm starting off with a very light wash of the lemon yellow hue and sap green, just mixing that up, and then adding a little bit of the darker version of the sap green to make it a little bit darker. Finally, I'm starting to paint in the tree on the right hand side by using the same colors that I use. It's kind of a very warm green, like a lemon yellow hue and sap green were the colors I found were very helpful for this. It's important to note the direction of the branches, and naturally branches get smaller and smaller as they go further away from the trunk of the tree. If you want to note that in your reference, in your painting. I'm just darkening up some of the rocks with kind of a grayish green color. I mixed up, I believe it was, I did a very light version of Ivory. I mixed up some Cerulean blue and burnt umber, and it made kind of a grayish tone, but it was very pale, so I added a little bit of ivory black to it to make it a little bit more gray. You can see that my other part of the painting's dried, like on the right hand side, and it dried much lighter than, remember when we first put the original colors down? They were kind of dark and more concentrated. Now it's much more translucent and light, so we're going to have to go back over that probably again. I highly recommend building up in multiple layers than just one layer, because you'll get the illusion of depth and 3D textures. Now I'm just blotting some areas in. I'm adding a little bit of very pale and a lot of water of ultramarine blue to the waterfall, so that it's not pure white, but it's really important to make sure to preserve your highlights. Like, I just left the waterfall completely white. I let the paper show through. However, I did go back over on some of the areas and add some shadows with the ultramarine blue so that it didn't look super flat and dull. Just going back over the mountain a little bit again. Adding some more colors to the mountain again. Now I'm starting to add more details to the rocks. I noticed that the green, like I said in the beginning, that the green value is a little too light, so I'm just darkening it up by adding some ivory black to it. However, it's really important to make sure that, I noticed that many artists don't like to use the black because they feel that it dulls and flattens their drawings or paintings. However, I believe that is true, that it can dull and flatten your paintings. However, I honestly don't have a problem with using black. It doesn't really do anything to my paintings. I just think it's not good to have it as the final layer. You want to add a color over it. Now I'm painting in the reflection, so I'm using the wet on wet technique. And by the way, if you guys didn't already know, the technique that I used in the mountains was a wet on dry technique, because I want to get more sharper and crisp details. Now I'm adding the water reflection. I'm making sure to keep everything very loose, because I'm using the wet on wet technique, and this allows your colors to bleed into each other. And there's not much detail in the reflection, so that's why I'm going very loose. Whereas on the actual scene, there's a lot more detail. So I'm adding some blue in, a little bit of cerulean blue to that, you see where the top left portion of the sky reflects into the water. That's where I'm adding it in. Painting in the water reflections can be challenging because you want to paint what you see, like what the real background is, but you don't want it to be too crisp and make it look like it's just flipped, like it's upside down right below the actual scene. You want to actually look like the water, so we want to create that illusion that there's water and ripples. We don't want it to just look like another painting upside down. So that's why I'm keeping everything very loose. Now I'm painting in the reflection of the mountains. I'm going back in with that same gray color that we used in the beginning, except this time it's a little lighter because I applied water to the whole thing, and water makes your colors much lighter than they actually are. I'm also using the same color for the mountain on the right. Adding some more darker values in. Just lightening it up a little bit. Now I'm starting to go in with that green color for the foliage this time, except it's much lighter than it is in the actual mountain. So I'm gonna have to darken a little bit. That's why I'm mixing up some ivory black and burnt umber to darken it up a little bit. And I find that it's really useful to follow the lines of the painting going downwards, to make sure everything matches up and looks more natural instead of just uniform. The water reflection should look very similar to the actual scene. If it doesn't look enough to like it, you're gonna want to go back and correct it until you get happy with it. A lot of practicing with water is just trial and error, just seeing what works and what doesn't work. You may notice something doesn't work exactly. You may notice something that I'm doing may not always work with your materials or supplies that you're using, or I might have made an error that you didn't make, or maybe you made an error that I didn't make. So it's really important to know how to self-critique your own drawings, I find, in paintings. So I'm now adding the reflection of that, that little tree on the right-hand side. Mixing up some lemon yellow hue and sap green. I noticed that my tree on the right was too dull, so I needed to add more yellow and green to it. I'm also adding blue to the bottom of the reflection. And I noticed that I added way too much of it, so I had to go in with a tissue. If you notice that you're applying your colors too dark or something, I highly recommend going back in with a tissue and lightening those areas up, or you might need to darken them. Finally, I'm starting to add in the foliage below into the reflection. Using that same green color that I used when I painted the foliage and trees when I was doing the mountain. Except this time it's lighter because the water is wet. And with the wet on wet technique, you want to make sure that you go pretty fast, because if your paper dries, the whole purpose is defeated. Of the wet on wet technique, because you want everything to be very wet so it can loosely bleed into things. If it's not wet enough, then just go back over it with water. Make sure to use a clean brush. Make sure you use clean water instead of, dirty water. It's important to make sure that you clean out your water every so forth during the process, so that it doesn't get too dirty, or your brushes don't get too dirty. A tip for caring for your brushes, make sure when you're painting with your brushes, only get the first bottom half wet with the paint. Don't let it get higher up. Don't let the bristles get too wet up to the metal part of it, because if that gets too wet, then paint can sit in there and it won't come out, and it'll make all your paintings contaminated with the color that you didn't want in it. So it's important to learn how to wash your brushes out correctly. Also, don't let your brushes sit in the water for a long time, because the colored water will just go up your brush and sit in there, and you'll have this really unpleasant after color left over. So I'm adding in more details. I noticed that obviously it wasn't dark enough, so I'm going back in with some of the grayish blue color that I had. It's kind of like a Payne's gray tone, even though I didn't have Payne's gray, I just called it that. And it's from Ultramarine and Ivory black and burnt umber. Blotting it a little bit. Now I'm finally starting to add in, the little tree on the right hand side. I'm starting to add that in, and I'm using a fan brush. I find it's very helpful for painting things like trees, especially pine and fir trees. And I just basically dipped it into a darkish green color, primarily mixed by sap green and ivory black. Finally, in this last part, I'm adding in the final details. As you may notice, the painting may already look finished to you, but it's really not 100% finished. I still notice that there's so many details that we need to add in, so I'm going in back over with my lightest lemon yellow hue to add in the grass. It's important to keep adding your details in until you're happy with it. Don't stop when you just think it's done. I highly encourage you to really look at it, really see how close it looks. Really think about what you can do to improve your art. For example, I noticed I need to fix the reflection of the sky a little bit, so that's why I'm darkening it up a little bit. It was too bright. I'm also darkening up the foliage, the plants, the greenery up in the rocks. Also adding more cerulean blue and a little bit of ultramarine to make it a little bit more intense to the sky. Going back over with the fan brush for the little blots that I used. And we're almost finished with this. We're very close to being done. If you notice some last things that you need to correct, then fix them. Like lastly I'm splattering some I'm splattering this dark color over for the little for the rocks kind of. I find it gives a nice realistic texture. Sorry about that. But I noticed it kind of went into the sky, so I'm going to go back over with the gouache to correct it. I find gouache very helpful if you make a mistake. It'll be there to correct it. It's more opaque than just regular watercolors. And some final shadows to the reflection from water. And I'm signing my piece. Make sure to sign your piece. Initial it. Taking the tape off. Make sure to peel off the tape very carefully. You don't want to rip the paper off. I'm just erasing the little pencil areas. And I'll be showing you the final result. And here's the final result. Thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button for more videos like this,